Hi everyone. Today we are going to learn a topic on gap models of service quality. Basically, to start off with, we need to understand the dimensions of service quality while we are still on the subject of customer satisfaction. So let's take a look at still another model that usually aids the marketer in better understanding of satisfaction. As we are all know that gap model is one of the important model which are basically followed in the management of service quality. So in that context, basically we look at how exactly a customer expectation as well as the service that is being offered to them differs. So in that context, usually we need to understand how exactly a difference is being created between the customer expectations and the perceptions which usually exist in the form of the service quality. And this gap model of service quality, which is sometimes it is been also called as a customer service gap model, and which usually comprises of 5 gap models, and initially it was proposed in 1985. And the basic importance of this model is that it demonstrates how the customer satisfaction is essentially a function of perception, as well as, in other words, we can also say that if the service provider meets or exceeds the customer expectations, they will be satisfied, and if not, they will be dissatisfied, and likely said so, as a result of which one of the customer service gaps usually represents in the same context. As we can see that usually we come across 4 gap models. Under that, the first gap model is, that is the gap 1, which mainly contradicts with respect to the difference between what the customer expected and the management perceived about the expectation of our customers. Then follow gap 2 model, basically defines the difference between the management perceptions of the customer expectations, and also it helps us with respect to translation of those perceptions into service quality specifications as well as the service designs. Then followed by, we have another model which basically represents, in the case of the difference between the specifications or the standards of service quality, and it also helps us to understand how exactly the actual service is delivered to the customer. Then later on, coming to the gap 4 model, it basically defines the difference between the services delivered to the customer and also the promise of the firm to customers about the service quality. As we are all very much clear with respect to how exactly each one of the gap model is going to define different set of gaps that is being identified here. And let us move to the next slide. So here we can say that the key factors which leads to the customer gaps are mainly representing with respect to the customer expectations as well as the customer perception. So in that, if we see the first gap, which usually defines in the case of knowledge gap, wherein which the first context is with respect to what the customer expects as well as what the management thinks of the customer expectations. If the management is not that much knowledgeable with respect to understanding what exactly the customer expects, this is a case where usually we come across this type of scenario called as the gap 1, or it is also called as the knowledge gap. Then followed by second one, that is not selecting the right service designs and standards, which mainly needs to address 2 issues. The first issue is how the management understands the customer needs, and in the meanwhile, the service delivery policies as well as the employee standards should also able to understand in line with the management understanding of the customer needs. And these things mainly are related to something called as the policy gaps. Then followed by the gap 3, which mainly addresses the issues which are mainly related to not delivering to the service standards. And in this case, we expect 2 things that are basically existing. One is the experience specification, then followed by the actual results. In services, most of the cases we usually explain the things in terms of the experience specifications or the experience what a customer goes through with respect to their previous what you call as the experience. And if these two things are not met with each other, this is a case where exactly we'll come across something called as the delivery gap. Then coming across the gap 4, which mainly addresses with respect to not matching the performance to the promises. Here we'll be mainly understanding with respect to how exactly the promises made by the service provider usually lacks here. So in this case, the first scenario is the delivery of customer expectations, then followed by what was communicated to the customer. And if both the things are not syncing with each other, that is a scenario where usually this sort of customer gap is going to exist. Then, without taking much time, let us move to the first model, that is called as the gap 1 model. You can see the key factors which usually leads us to the gap 1 are the two factors. One is the customer expectations, and the second factor is the company perception of the customer expectations. So here you can see the text which is being highlighted using the bullet points mainly indicates what are the three important the sub factors which usually contributes with respect to the existence of the gap 1. So coming across the first one, that is the inadequate marketing research orientation, that is the first sub factor, followed by the lack of upward communication, then followed by insufficient relationship focus. So when we say there is an existence of inadequate marketing research orientation, it mainly tells us with respect to how exactly the the outcome of a marketing research was pretty much insufficient with respect to understanding what exactly a customer expects. Then followed by, if the research is not focused on the service quality, basically the customer will not able to understand what exactly a company tries to offer to the end users. Then followed by the inadequate use of marketing research will can also be said that it is also one of the main factors with respect to determining how exactly things are not going in the right way. Then followed by the second point, that is the lack of upward communications, which usually has to be taken into consideration from the company side towards the customers. So how exactly you are going to communicate, that is from the top level to the customer understanding with respect to how exactly the service is going to be offered. Then the third point mainly relates with respect to the inefficient relationship focus, which mainly relates to the lack of market segmentation, then followed by there is no proper usage of the CRM strategies and so on and so forth. Then coming towards the gap 2 model. Then coming to the towards the gap 2 model, which mainly relates to something called as the policy gap. Here the key factors that has to be indicated with respect to is the customer driven and service standards, as well as the management perception of the customer expectations. So here when we talk in terms of the policies, it should mainly reflect with respect to the difference between the management perception of the customer needs, as well as how to translate these understandings into the service reality, or it can also be called as the service delivery, which are mainly focusing towards the policies as well as the standards. And using these thing, we can basically try out using the example which usually indicates with respect to how exactly an hotel assumes that a number of customers have complained that the phone rings with so many times before it is been answered. And here the management wants to address this issue, so it establishes a policy that phone must be answered quickly. What's your interpretation with respect to the word quickly should be in terms of two rings? So that is how specifically you should able to form your policies. Then followed by the gap 3 model, which mainly tells us with respect to the delivery of services, or it is also been called as the delivery gap. Here we have four important factors. One is the deficiency of human resource policies, which mainly contradicts with respect to ineffective recruitment, or uh, the service employees having role ambiguity or the role conflict. So all these things mainly are treated with respect to the frontline service workers, who are also being called as one of the key factors in order to make sure that the customer should able to experience something called as the customer delight. Then followed by how the failure to manage both the supply and demand, with respect to making sure that how exactly crowd should be managed and how that smooth transition has to take place in terms of making sure that there should not be over reliance with respect to enhancement of your prices depending upon the excess of demand that is being generated. Then followed by the customers not able to fulfill their roles and responsibility, and this basically addresses some important factors which mainly relates to the service provider should always take a step forward with respect to tutoring their customers in the right way, so that they should able to understand their roles and responsibilities, and which should not have any sort of negative impact on each other, that is between both the customer as well as the service provider. And the fourth important thing that needs to be addressed is with respect to problems with the service intermediaries. And most of the time we usually experience this sort of what you call as conflicts, which usually arises between intermediaries. As we all know that service is entirely dependent on a teamwork, and no individuality is going to exist here. And if we are going through any sort of these sort of group activities, or we can also call that as a team activities, or complementing with each other with respect to achieving service excellence. So in all these cases, usually uh, it mainly depends on how exactly each person is going to complement with each other with respect to enhancement of their performances. And we should also able to identify the key service employees who are working there, so that they should be rewarded properly. So all these things are very much important with respect to addressing the problem with service deliveries. Then followed by the next gap is mainly related to the gap 4. And the gap 4 should always able to explain something called as the communication gap. Here, if anytime you can see that marketing communication is very much important, so that we should have a continuous engagement with our customers, so that they should able to develop some sort of tendency to view the communication as an independent aspect. Then followed by inefficient management of customer expectation, that will also help us with respect to understanding how exactly customers are not being educated properly with respect to understanding their expectations. And other important thing is war promising, by showing so many things which are not that much appropriate with respect to the reality of your services. Then followed by inadequate horizontal communication, that is intra-team discussion should happen in a very smooth manner, so that each of the employees who are working there should able to understand their roles and responsibilities, and there should not be differences of policies or procedure across the branches or unit, which usually we come across in sort of franchisee services. And these are few of the things which are very much important, or which usually plays a very key role with respect to understanding all the gap models, that is gap 1, 2, 3 as well as 4. I hope this video was helpful for you to understanding the concept on gap models. Thank you.